Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. Today, we're talking with Katherine Cavagnaro about a crash that occurred in Kentucky last week that killed a young CFI and his student. Now, the crash was tragic on multiple levels and gathered a lot of online attention because of the CFI's social media posts made throughout the flight that demeaned the student. The CFI even documented the line of thunderstorms they flew into before the aircraft broke up in flight. Last week in episode 294, we took you along for a demo flight in the new Diamond DA-50RG. I spent about an hour flying that fun aircraft, and if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/294. And so that you don't miss next week's episode, go to whatever app that you're using to listen to me and take a moment right now and touch either the subscribe key or, if you're using the Apple Podcast app, the follow key, so that next week's episode is downloaded for free. And this is a listener-supported show, so if you've ever learned something from this show that's helped you become a safer pilot, or maybe to pass a check ride, think about what you might pay a CFI for a flight and make a donation to help support the show. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Coming up in the news for the week of October 2nd, 2023, AOPA Senior Vice President Richard McSpadden has died in a plane crash. Shocking video has emerged of a light twin spinning to the ground, and a Vermont man is arrested for stalking a woman in his Cessna 180. All this and more, and the news starts now. From AOPA, they write, "We are deeply saddened to report that Richard McSpadden, AOPA Senior Vice President, died in an aircraft accident outside Lake Placid, New York on Sunday afternoon. The Cardinal 177, in which Richard was in the right seat, experienced an emergency after takeoff. The airplane attempted to return to the airport, but failed to make the runway. Both occupants lost their lives. Richard was a very accomplished pilot, including serving as commander of the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds during his military career." Now, I've read online that some people have commented that due to terrain, there are few options should an engine failure occur while taking off from runway 32 at Lake Placid. Also, I received this text message from a client. He said, "This is making me reconsider flying altogether. If it can happen to someone like him, what chances do low-time pilots have? A lot of pilot forums share my sentiments." And I wrote back to him that I thought that was the wrong conclusion to draw. We don't know the details of what happened. And statistically, there's only about one fatal accident per every 100,000 hours flown. And if you eliminate all the accidents due to poor pilot judgment, flying is approximately as safe as driving a car. Richard, by the way, was one of our listeners to this podcast. I met him at Sun and Fun a few years ago, and he said that he listened to Aviation News Talk while in his hangar working on his plane. And my thoughts are with Richard's family. From the dailymail.co.uk, plane seen spiraling midair before crashing into an Oregon home. Shocking video shows a plane spiraling out of the sky Tuesday evening, landing on a house in Oregon in a crash that killed 2 people and left another hospitalized. The crash took place on North Cedar Street in the town of Newburgh, about 25 miles southwest of Portland. A Facebook video captured by a nearby resident and posted to Facebook shows the plane's stunning spiral. And I've looked at that video, and I agree. It's very rare to see a video of an airplane spiraling out of the sky. The plane originated from the Hillsborough Flight Academy. The pilot training school is located about 20 miles north of Newburgh. The aircraft crashed through the roof into the bottom of the home. No one was home at the time. Now, according to aviationsafety.net, the aircraft was a Piper Seminole, November 8360 Kilo. And I've looked at the ADS-B data on FlightAware and ADS-B Exchange. The aircraft was level at 5,000 feet and 155 knots when it began a slow climb and the airspeed began to drop. Over about 2 minutes, the aircraft flew a straight line while gaining 400 feet of altitude and slowing from 150 knots to 94 knots. In 6 seconds, it shot up another 400 feet while slowing to 31 knots. It then began to spiral to the ground, dropping at over 7,000 feet per minute. Now, there are several possible maneuvers the aircraft could have been doing. My guess is that it was a VMC demo that went very badly, and frankly, that's the maneuver that I feel puts me at greatest risk when I'm teaching in a twin. And I encourage you, if you teach in a twin or fly in a twin, to review the steps required for this maneuver each and every time before performing the maneuver. From newspressnow.com, North Dakota lawmaker killed in Utah plane crash. A North Dakota lawmaker flew to Arizona to be part of his sister's send-off before she was deployed overseas. Hours later, State Senator Doug Larson, his wife, and their 2 sons were killed on their way home when their single-engine Piper Cherokee crashed in Utah on Sunday after a flying stop. The weather at the time of the crash was mild with scattered light showers, wide visibility, and gentle winds in the area around the airport, according to the National Weather Service. Video posted by KSL-TV of Salt Lake City showed the plane went down in a desert area devoid of vegetation and sustained extensive damage to the nose area and right wing. It came to rest upright. Larson had been a Black Hawk helicopter pilot in the North Dakota National Guard and had logged about 1,776 total military flight hours. Larson had recently entered his commercial pilot's license and had received at least one job offer from a commuter airlines with a goal of flying for a major airline. FAA records show that a pilot with that name received a commercial certificate on September 15th. From generalaviationnews.com, when left isn't right. Now, this comes from an ASRS report, NASA form written by the pilot. He wrote, I was taxiing in the Cessna 152 from self-serve fuel down taxiway X to runway XXR, so right runway, for departure. After run-up, I was advised to switch to tower and did so and continue the taxi to the runway hold short bars. I called up tower and said I was coming up on the right runway and ready to go. Tower responded promptly with instructions to take off from the left runway. Although I was anticipating the right runway for takeoff, being told to take off on the left was not out of the usual, as I've received similar instructions prior to this event where I have to cross the closer runway to depart off the left. When I was given this instruction, I very explicitly mentioned the left 2 times on my reply call to avoid any mistakes, but also for myself as an out-loud reminder that I was now departing off the left and not the original runway I'd been planning for. I said, okay, continuing to XX left and XX left clear for takeoff. As I crossed the hold short and finished my final checks, lights, camera, action, final clear, I looked left and immediately noticed another Cessna on a short final for the right runway, while at the same time braking quickly and coming to a stop while the frequency also went crazy with blocked transmissions, assuming everyone chiming in to prevent a possible incursion or accident. Although I had begun crossing the hold short, I did not enter the actual pavement surface of the runway, and the other Cessna executed a safe go-around. At that point, I asked the tower what they wanted me to do, and they instructed me to do a 180 U-turn and hold short of the right, which I complied with, and they cleared for takeoff from the right. There had been a student pilot holding short opposite of me at the left runway, and it's possible tower thought that that is who called for takeoff. I'm always diligent with my final checks before taking a runway and departing, and I think my final look left before fully entering the runway is what prevented this from becoming more serious. From now on, I will make sure to have a more big-picture understanding before rolling for takeoff. I was thinking why I did not see him on my ADS-B, and I realized because both my GPS units were zoomed into airport taxi diagrams. I always cock the airplane sideways when holding short due to the high wing not allowing you to see any aircraft on final, but as I had been on a slow roll already when I was cleared for takeoff, I did not get to see final until that final moment. A nice wake-up call to always take it slow and verify everything and have that big-picture situational awareness. And I just wanted to comment on one thing. The pilot said, I said, okay, continuing to XX left and XX left cleared for takeoff. In that particular case, I probably would have said that I was crossing the right and would be taking off on the left, making it clear as to which aircraft I was that was lined up for the 2 runways. And from boldmethod.com, this is another ASRS report written by the pilot. Crew cancels IFR and lands at the wrong airport. An ATP-rated corporate jet crew with thousands of hours in type landed at the wrong airport 30 miles from their destination without a clearance from the tower after canceling IFR. The pilots wrote, on an IFR flight plan going to TVI, ATC gave us a descent to 4,000 and asked us to advise the airport in sight. It was late afternoon and the sun was just on the horizon and directly on our nose. Forward visibility was greatly restricted as the sun was somewhat blinding. We were at 4,000 feet looking for the airport, which we saw on our nose about 3 to 5 miles out. We advised the airport in sight about 5 miles out at 12 o'clock and told ATC we could cancel IFR. TVI is a non-towered field, and we wanted to transition to Unicom to check traffic and advise our position and intentions. We were talking to Valdosta Approach. Valdosta said, Roger Squawk, VFR, frequency change approved. We were somewhat rushed to get the airplane slowed, configured, and established. We entered the traffic pattern, announced our position, completed the approach and landing checklists, and turned final. We announced our position on final twice, searching for conflicting traffic, and landed. After landing and taxiing to the FBO, we realized that we had landed at VLD, that's Valdosta, instead of TVI at Towered Class D Airport. Immediately upon realizing this, we called Valdosta Tower and told them of our mistake. This was our error. We were looking into the sun and misidentified VLD as TVI. One contributing factor was ATC descending us to 4,000 feet so far from our destination and asking us to report the airport in sight. We were well beyond visual range of TVI, but within visual range of VLD. It would have been helpful had ATC questioned our advising airport in sight when we were beyond visual range, or at least told us to contact Valdosta Tower, as we were very close to their airspace. But had we taken extra steps to positively identify the airport, this event would not have happened. And in other headlines, last week Congress passed legislation to extend the statutory authority of the FAA through December 31st, 2023, as part of a continuing resolution to fund the federal government for 45 days. Also, FAA Administrator nominee Michael Whitaker will appear this week before the Senate Commerce Committee to discuss his nomination. Politico.com published an article on Wednesday in which they quoted this podcast, Aviation News Talk's interview with Mr. Whitaker, in which he discussed his prop strike. And Cirrus Aircraft has opened a new innovation center at the Duluth International Airport in Minnesota. The 189,000 square foot building includes a material and processes lab, a new integration test lab, an advanced design and development lab, and new environmental equipment and testing capabilities. And finally, from TimesUnion.com, pilot accused of stalking New York woman via small airplane flying from Vermont. A man has been accused of stalking a woman in New York via his small airplane flying out of an airport in nearby Vermont, police said. The pilot, age 65, was scheduled to appear in court Wednesday in Bennington, Vermont. He was arrested Tuesday as he was driving into the William H. Morse State Airport. Police said his single-engine Cessna 180 was at the airport and he had been flying from there. The pilot, from Manchester, New Hampshire, had been served with a temporary order of protection from a court in Saratoga, New York in May. A specific condition of that order was that he cease and desist from flying any and all aircraft while the order remains in effect, Bennington Police Chief Paul Doucette said in a news release. Police had been notified by the FBI in Albany that New York authorities had been investigating the pilot on suspicion of stalking the woman in Schuylerville for several years, Doucette said. Schuylerville is about 30 miles away from the Bennington airport. Officers were able to determine that the pilot was in fact flying his airplane from the William H. Morse State Airport and last seen flying west toward New York several days earlier, Doucette said. The pilot was charged Tuesday with aggravated stalking, impeding false information to a police officer, and resisting arrest. He posted a $5,000 bail. That's the news for this week. Coming up next, a few of my updates. And later we'll talk with Katherine Cavagnaro about a crash that occurred in Kentucky last week that killed a young CFI and his student. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's start with a different kind of good news today, which is if you're listening to me before Tuesday, October the 10th, you still have a chance to buy the Lightspeed Delta Zulu headset at the old price of $10.99. Now, they increased the price by $100 a couple of months ago, but they've had a 3-week promotion celebrating the 1-year anniversary of the headset, which they say they've sold over 10,000 of. Now, you've heard me talk about it before. I use it when I fly in the helicopter. It includes the carbon monoxide alert system, which told me that I was getting carbon monoxide when I was hovering in the helicopter. But more importantly, it really helps me with my hearing since it's got a built-in frequency equalizer that you can tune for any hearing loss that you have. Now, as I've told you before, Lightspeed supports the show anytime you buy one of these headsets from us. But to make a purchase and for us to get the credit, you have to start with one of the links on our show notes, which you can find at aviationnewstalk.com, or you can find it inside the app that you're using. Just click on any of the links that take you to Lightspeed, and when you buy a headset, they'll send us a nice referral fee. So if you find that you sometimes need extra headsets when you fly with the family, or if you just want to treat yourself to an upgrade, it might be a good time to buy. Again, thanks for supporting us and for supporting Lightspeed. And I'd like to tell you about a great new podcast called Air Traffic Out of Control. Now, I mentioned the podcast briefly in episode 293 because it was on that podcast that I first heard the ATC recordings for the Endeavour Flight 1516 smoke in the cockpit emergency that we talked about in that episode. Now, the podcast brings you really interesting ATC recordings that are sometimes funny and occasionally almost unbelievable. Also, the show is hosted by Amy Tango Charlie with her delightful British accent. There's a new episode out every Wednesday, and they also do short flyby episodes throughout the week. So look for Air Traffic Out of Control wherever you go for podcasts. And here's more good news. In the last 2 weeks, we've had a slew of people pass check rides. We've had 3 of our mega supporters. These are the folks that donate $50 a month or more pass check rides. So congratulations to Shannon Day for his IFR check ride, which he passed in a Cirrus down in Scottsdale. Also, congratulations to Drew Anderson, who passed his IFR check ride, and to him for ordering a Cirrus SR22T last month. And finally, to mega supporter Chris Waters. Now, he sent me a note that says, wasn't that you doing an instrument approach to runway 31 in Hollister yesterday? Sounded a bit like you in a Robinson helicopter. I was doing my glider rating check ride. We waited for the helicopter on 2-4, then got towed up to complete the last maneuvers. Right after it cleared the runway, check ride went well, though the winds were getting sporty by the end. Chris, congratulations on your glider check ride. And yes, guilty as charged. That was me doing an instrument lesson in the helicopter. And congratulations to Patreon supporter Mac Apodaca. He passed his private check ride yesterday, and we will be flying in a Cirrus to help him transition into that aircraft sometime soon. And also congratulations to Patreon supporter Avi Ben Menahem. He says, just want to let you know I passed my commercial on my Cirrus. The podcast was extremely helpful. Again, thanks for the great podcast. Always waiting for the next episode. Well, Avi, here it is. And finally, new patron supporter James Cavagnaro wrote that he listens both to this show and the Airplane Geeks podcast that I co-host. He says, I wanted to let you know that all the information on both podcasts helped me pass ground school in an Aranca sedan. Now, that's a 1940s aircraft, so James, have fun flying that when you get fully checked out. And more good news of a totally different kind. I had a colonoscopy last week, and apparently all went well. And I mention that because the focus of Aviation News Talk is pilot safety. And part of staying safe is seeing the doctor when needed. And I also mention it because there's research that shows that some men avoid going to the doctor for a variety of reasons. Now, I have a particular reason for not skipping colonoscopies when they're due, and that is that my wife's father died of colon cancer when she was just 14. And I just can't bear to let her lose another man in her life to that. So that's my motivation for making sure I schedule them and don't skip them. So if you're overdue in seeing the doctor for anything or getting some procedure, get it done so you can remain healthy and continue flying for many years to come. And I just want to mention that I've had a new benefit for Patreon supporters for the last month or two, and that is they can now get this show a little bit early. And when they do, it's an ad-free version, which is to say that we cut out most of the stuff about Patreon and subscribing to the show and things like that. So if you've been thinking, yeah, I really should support the show, I enjoy it, I get a lot of benefit out of it, that may be just one more good reason to go ahead and do it now. Here are the names of the people who've signed up over the last 2 weeks to support the show. See if you know any of them. We have 2 new supporters who support the show at the $50 a month level. Welcome to Shannon Day and to Scott Sutton. And other new Patreon supporters include J.P. Hare, Jason Nadell, Keenan Sturgis, Bill Watson is back after a hiatus, Christopher Cole, Ed Perry, who added his pledge up to $35 a month, James Cavanaugh, Brandon Schock, and Jose Cabrera. We also had some one-time donations via PayPal. My thanks to Frank Obermeyer, Thomas Atlas, and Brian Wormsley. It's easy to join the club and sign up to support the show. Just go out to aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Or if you'd like to make a one-time donation, go out to aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. Coming up next, our conversation with Katherine Cavagnaro about that tragic accident in Kentucky last week that killed a young CFI and a student. All right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about Katherine Cavagnaro. She's an expert on spins, aerobatics, and upset recovery, and owns a flight school called Ace Aerobatic School, located at the Sewanee-Franklin County Airport on the campus of the University of the South. In addition to holding ATP and CFI certificates, she is a professor of mathematics at the University of the South and has chaired the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science. Katherine is the 2020 National Certificated Flight Instructor of the Year, and she also serves as the designated pilot examiner. And now here's our conversation with Katherine Cavagnaro. And here to talk with us today about all of this is Katherine Cavagnaro. Katherine, welcome to the show under somewhat tragic circumstances.
Thanks for having me back, Max.
Well, you had sent me a text message that said that I can't remember the word, but I think you said outraged or something about that particular flight and incident. Let's talk about the flight first. What were some of the red flags that you saw with this particular flight?
Right. So, first off, my introduction to this was from the social media post that the flight instructor made himself. And as you saw in the video, first of all, he's showing a lot of impatience for the student who's walking around the airplane with a checklist. And that's a huge red flag. We as flight instructors should be encouraging a careful pre-flight, especially at night, and one that should involve a checklist. So that's the first red flag. And, really this flight instructor should be helping the student, watching the student, making sure the student is doing everything in the pre-flight correctly, instead of, filming it and ridiculing him. And I think that's the part that's just so distressing to me, is that part of this video.
Yeah, there were a number of things that were done that just didn't make a whole lot of sense. This was a flight in which the flight instructor apparently planned to meet all of the night requirements for his student in a single flight of 3 hours. What other kind of ways could they have structured this to make this a more safe flight?
Sure. I remember that evening because I often will look at the radar because I might have plans to fly myself. And I remember that there was quite a line of storms north of me in Tennessee and Kentucky moving west to east, and they were impressive. And really, I don't think anybody should have been flying that evening. And it's a particularly poor choice for an instructional flight with a student pilot. So apparently they had tried to get all 3 hours in that night. And that's unfortunate. That suggests to me that there might be some box checking because, of course, a student pilot needs to present at least 3 hours of night flying for the private pilot check ride. And if you think about perhaps breaking that up into 2 or maybe even 3 evenings, then, that's more opportunities to do more pre-flights in different situations at night. So again, getting it all taken care of in one night suggests box checking to me. And especially with weather like there was that evening, this flight just should have been canceled and postponed for another evening.
Yeah, I agree on all that. I thought it was interesting that they were looking to get all 3 hours in. I counted they did 9 landings at the destination airport, so the return would have been the 10th landing, and they would have completed everything. I got to tell you, in 20 years as a flight instructor, I have never done all of the night requirements in a single flight. To me, it really doesn't make a lot of sense, and perhaps I was impressed about that relatively soon after I became a CFI, when a CFI friend departed, I would say, after 11 o'clock at night to begin a 3-hour flight with a student. And I remember him saying that he got home that night at 3 a.m. in the morning. And now this was a gentleman who's probably in his 40s or early 50s. Not that it really mattered. At any age, people are going to be tired at 3 in the morning. Their skills are going to be poor. They're going to make poor judgments. To me, that was just absolutely nuts. When I teach night flying, I always look to see if we can perhaps get the long cross country done the first evening that we meet. And if we can't from a weather standpoint, then we'll do 7 or maybe 8 landings, maybe even our local airport where we can stay close in case the clouds roll in or the weather changes and get on the ground within a matter of a couple of minutes. And then we'll do the long cross country on the second night. So it gives us 2 good opportunities to try and accomplish the long cross country under the best weather conditions. It seems to me in this particular case, a gentleman might have chosen to do 7 or 8 landings at the home airport and then put it down, or they might have done the cross country, made 1 landing at the destination. That would have gotten them home an hour sooner, before the weather rolled in.
Right. And, it strikes me too. And what I tell my fellow instructors is we're not just teaching when our mouths are open and closing, right? We're not just teaching when we're talking. We're teaching when we're doing. We teach by example. And we're supposed to be teaching responsible flying. So, trying to squeeze this in with weather approaching like it was, it's not teaching the responsibility that we want our students to fly with in the future.
Yes, and often just canceling a flight or changing the parameters is an important way for people to understand that, oh, okay, sometimes we can't always complete a flight as we'd planned, or we shouldn't complete a flight as we'd planned because that's not the conservative thing to do. Also, you talked about squeezing things in. I noticed that the final social media post that the CFI sent had a picture of the cells that were between him and the airport. And I measured the distance. It was roughly about 15 miles between cells, and the airport was kind of in the clear between those two cells. And it appears that perhaps they were trying to get through that narrow gap. Talk a little bit about flying between cells in a thunderstorm line.
Well, Max, even in the day, that's not smart. But you know, and I know that at night, it's very difficult to see if you are going to be flying into, clouds or bad weather. So it was just exceptionally bad decision making at night. And if memory serves from that social media post, I believe the airplane was still on the southern part of that route back to Owensboro when he took that snapshot. So I assume that by the time they made it closer to Owensboro, that line, which he acknowledged was moving very quickly, that those were his words, something about a hornet's nest. Those cells were moving quickly. So I assume that they had moved farther east, when he made it farther north. So I imagine they met someplace. Anyway, it's just such profoundly poor decision making.
Yes, and the FAA says that pilots should stay at least 20 miles from a thunderstorm cell. So to try to fly between two cells 15 miles apart is crazy, especially since the next red radar that you might see in your iPad or glass cockpit is about 10 minutes old. And then at that time, the cells will have moved. Now, I was with a client one night when we were trying to get to a destination, and we were looking at a lot of different weather options, and he kept constantly pointing out to me that the weather was better on the other side of the line of thunderstorms, and that's where we needed to be. So he was all set to, have us plow through this line of thunderstorms. Ultimately, I was able to convince him that no, we really needed to divert and spend the night elsewhere. In this particular case, clearly they could have landed at any of the many airports along the way, or they could have returned to the airport that they were at. But I have a feeling there was something else driving the flight instructor to try and complete this flight. We refer to that as get-home-itis. He had made a comment about needing to be up at 4:30 a.m. in the morning. Talk about that a little bit.
Oh, right. Get there-itis. And, it's something that in our own pre-flights of ourselves, when we go through the I am safe checklist before each flight, that's something that it's real. I know that I have felt it, that sense of get there-itis. And I always make myself stop and really look, okay, is this really worth your life? And of course, the answer to that question always helps guide my decision to take a safer route. So I think get there-itis probably has affected every one of us. And it's just, we need to show these students, we need to exhibit the kind of behavior that is going to be an antidote for that feeling of get there-itis.
Yeah, in this particular case, he had commented about needing to be up at 4:30 a.m. in the morning. Any of the other options we just talked about would clearly screw up that plan if he landed somewhere else and waited for the line of thunderstorms to pass. But I'm just thinking about the original plan, which apparently was to take off around 8 p.m., get back around 11 p.m., drive home, and then get up at 4:30 in the morning. What do you think about that as a plan?
Right. So fatigue is one of the most insidious factors. And of course, it's a factor in the I'm safe checklist. So planning, that's just planning to be fatigued for this subsequent flight. So again, just bad decision.
Yeah, and I've read that sleep of as little as something like 5 or 6 hours is a kind of equivalent performance to being drunk at the 0.08 alcohol percentage level. And I think a lot of pilots just don't give that the credence that and respect that it needs. I think sometimes we have this Superman or Superwoman, mentality that, hey, we're pilots and we can do it all. But does that make us better at handling fatigue?
Oh my gosh, no. And again, it's so insidious when it creeps up on us. It compared with, say, alcohol, as you mentioned, again, part of the I'm safe checklist. It's easy. That's a cut and dry kind of thing. I did have a glass of wine with dinner last night, or I didn't have a glass of wine with dinner. That's kind of a yes, no. I know personally, it's very difficult to assess exactly how rested I am. My sleep sometimes is great, sometimes it's not as great. And that's always a careful part of my assessment when I am going to take a flight. But again, there is nobody I know that could possibly be rested after, say, 2 or 3 hours of sleep. So this is just planning to be fatigued. And again, it's just a shame.
Yeah, it definitely shows a lack of understanding of how important it is to be well rested when we fly. So let's talk a little bit about posting social media just in general. I mean, I'm sure there are safe ways to do it and unsafe ways to do it. What kind of guidelines or suggestions do you have for pilots and flight instructors who may want to post to social media?
Right. I've certainly taken photos and videos when I fly. I do that carefully, and I try not to do that in any sort of a critical phase of flight. But, posting to social media, it can wait. It can wait till you're on the ground. So I think that's a good rule to use. Just post when you're on the ground.
Mm. Yeah, and I found that it's sometimes easy to get distracted. And there are times when I've had my iPhone out filming and I just put it down. It's like, okay, wait a minute. We're coming in for a landing and we need to, usually it's the other person who's landing, but still as a flight instructor, I need to be guarding the controls. I need to have my hands very close to the stick and be able to respond instantly. What I have found actually works a little bit better is if I plan in advance and I mount 1 or 2 GoPro cameras. Boy, once those are set up and they're running, I totally forget that they're even there and they're not a distraction. So that's just one thing that people might want to do if they're going to be filming.
All right, I think that's a great idea. And I've done the same thing. You turn it on when you start up the airplane and you turn it off when the airplane's shut down.
Well, I think we'll talk about the flight instructor a little bit more in the future, but let's talk about what pilots should be doing if they find themselves sitting next to a pilot or a flight instructor who seems to be exercising poor judgment in one way or the other. Talk about that a little bit.
I think earlier in my career, just in general, as a pilot, as a mathematician, as just earlier on, I would have been loath to say anything. I might have been uncomfortable next to somebody and I probably wouldn't have said anything. But, over the years, I've seen what happens when we are quiet. And I think earlier on in my life, I would have been loath to report somebody like this or mention anything. I would have just probably sucked it up and kept going. But learning what I have over the years about how some of these stories turn out, I'm much more vocal than I used to be. I don't know how you are, Max, but I would recommend, if you ever find yourself in a situation sitting next to a pilot who makes you feel uncomfortable for any reason, and especially with respect to safety of the flight, you really need to mention that to a higher up at the flight school.
Yeah, certainly if you survive the flight, which this person, didn't, it makes sense to fire your flight instructor, which means never fly with them again under, whatever circumstances. If that's the only person available to you at the flight school, it makes sense to change flight schools. You just kind of do whatever it takes to be safe. Now, I think that student pilots in particular are at a disadvantage because they may not recognize unsafe kinds of situations. So it probably makes sense for them to talk with other people, kind of describe what happened and, get their take on, hey, what do you think about this thing that happened in the air? I would go so far as to say that if this student, and by the way, I think this is this would be very difficult for a student pilot to do. But in this particular situation, if he recognized that things were going really badly, I think it would have been acceptable for him to fake some excuse to get us on the ground. Hey, man, I'm feeling sick. Let's get on the ground now. I think I'm going to throw up. Oh, okay, let's go land at that little airport down below. And at that point, you can say, hey, I'm not getting back in the airplane with you. I'm going to call somebody to come get me. And thanks very much.
Yeah, I've actually done that before. I was in an airplane with somebody who was yelling and angry, and this person really wasn't responding to reason. So I asked to land at the next airport or go do some, practicing at a nearby airport. I got out of the plane. I called my son, asked for a ride home. I didn't want to get back in the plane with him again.
Wow. So that's actually happened to you.
It has.
I think the worst situation I was in was a gentleman who was very angry at himself for, not performing well. And I kind of realized at that point, wow, he is so angry. He could stuff this airplane into the ground and I might not be able to prevent him from doing that. And of course, I never flew with him again. But yeah, these are kind of, 1% problems in the population. But if you fly often enough, there's a good chance you'll encounter these people.
Oh, right. I talk about, I think it's good in general for all of us pilots to learn from multiple instructors. I've certainly enjoyed that in the past because, I, in assembling my own philosophy on flying an airplane, I like what, person A did, or person B over here has this other, thing that he or she does. And I've really cherry picked what I thought were some of the best qualities of the instructors with whom I've flown. And I've really enjoyed that. But as you say, Max, the more instructors you fly with, chances are you're going to run into someone who does make you feel uncomfortable or does something that you think is not safe. And again, we need to call that out as a community.
Yeah, this whole story made me start to wonder about CFI evaluations. I know the industry is pretty desperate to get CFIs because so many of them are being hired by the airlines. And I'm kind of curious. I've been teaching for 20 years and never in that time has any flight school employee said, hey, Max, I'm going to ride along with you today to observe you. What's kind of the state of evaluation of CFIs after they get hired? Are they pretty much on their own or is there some oversight that you're aware of?
Yeah, I think that varies wildly. First of all, I run a flight school and it's a one-person operation. So obviously I'm the only person who supervises myself. I also manage a flight school at the University of the South, Sewanee, and that's a one instructor flight school. And I hired a terrific instructor, and he and I are in constant communication, and I fly with him. So, I get to witness, his good work, and so I'm happy with that. I know Part 141 schools, those instructors need supervision, I think at least annually. But then, the Part 61 operations, I don't know. There's certainly no requirement that they be observed. No, I'm hoping that if there's one healthful thing that comes out of this very, very sad situation is I hope that flight school managers and chief flight instructors will take it as an opportunity to maybe institute some rules where everybody is going to get observed more often than they have been.
Yeah. Well, so let's talk about some of the CFI actions here. They're just kind of pretty amazing, I guess. You've talked about how on the pre-flight, he was kind of somewhat demeaning, in fact, not just of the student himself, but demeaning of, for example, people in Special Olympics, which of course caters to people with intellectual disabilities. That's pretty amazing that he would insult not just as a student, but also people with disabilities at the same time. The drumming of the fingers on the fuselage showing a certain amount of impatience. I went to the Facebook page for one of his relatives who said that the boy was just being aggravated, referring to the CFI, because the student was not moving at the speed that Junior thought he should move at. Is there a speed that pilots should move at?
So let me say that once again, you can't watch this video and not be just deeply disturbed and offended on so many levels. And you mentioned a couple of those, Max. I wouldn't be surprised if the instructor were the only problem in this flight. But let's just say for the sake of argument that there was a problem with a student. Just in general, if a flight instructor feels that a student maybe isn't progressing at an appropriate pace, those are not comments for social media. They are not comments for even just chatting with friends. Those are comments for flight school personnel. It could be that a change in a flight instructor might help. It could be just a new set of eyes on the student might help. So if there were any legitimate concerns, these social media posts are exactly the wrong way to go about it. But again, just the picture that gets painted, I wouldn't be surprised if the only problem on board that flight was the flight instructor that night.
Well, one of the things to me that's fascinating is this person had been a flight instructor for around 4 months, had gotten his private about 16 months before. So in the grand scheme of things, pretty low time. And apparently he was under time pressure, needed to get back so that he could get what little sleep he could. And yet I didn't see him assisting with a pre-flight. He seemed to be just standing there watching the entire time. To me, would have totally made sense. Hey, chip in, help with the pre-flight, move things along. I've done that so many times. To me, that's a logical thing to do instead of kind of just stand aside and play supervisor and wait.
Yeah, I agree. My sense is that, those videos were taken purely just to ridicule.
Yeah. Well, you had mentioned something about hazardous attitudes. Tell us that story.
Yeah. So a number of years ago, I gave a private check ride for a man, and several months later, he obtained his instrument rating somehow, and then a couple months after that, I believe, he took off in a new to him airplane with a new to him panel with his new instrument rating at night in low IFR with his family members on board. And it floored me because I just wondered how many red flags does a person need to see before the plane goes back in the hangar. And as the examiner who had given him his private ride, I stared at the ceiling at night, several nights, wondering, did I miss some sort of hazardous attitude? And that weighed heavily on me. It turns out a year or two later, I had a conversation with some folks in the flight school who told me that, when he was a student pilot, we had trouble with him because he was flying with his family members. And I was floored because I just wondered, why did they sign him off for any practical exam when he exhibited that kind of behavior? I have a 4-hour snapshot of somebody's aviation life. And during that time, certainly hazardous attitudes is one of the things that's on my mind. It's one of the things that I'm trying to assess whether this person has a healthful attitude toward aviation. I want every pilot, I say this at the beginning of every check ride, I just want to make sure that you're going to be out there flying for decades to come. And, I was just so disappointed that that person was presented to me and signed off for a practical exam. And I've just asked the aviation community, if you see attitudes like this, these people need to, first of all, be recommended for some sort of, counseling with the flight school on these sorts of attitudes. And if that counseling isn't successful, these people do not need to be sent up for practical exams. And so coming back to this pilot, I just wonder along the way if anybody saw any of these hazardous attitudes, because I see several hazardous attitudes in that video that he posted to social media. And my hope is that this will serve as a reminder to all of us that if we see those hazardous attitudes, they're not going to go away. They're not going to evaporate. They could turn into a tragedy that claims the health and or life of others. So, I hope we can all learn from this and call that behavior out if we see it.
Yes, one of the things I've figured out over the last 20 years is if you see somebody do something a little risky, that doesn't tell you the limit of the risk that they're willing to go to. I observed a pilot one time doing a little showboating as he was taxiing. He basically would come in at relatively high speed, turn off the engine, continue to coast, and then spin the airplane all around in a 180 at the parking location. And I thought, well, that's a little risky and unnecessary. And that pilot eventually killed himself with a low-level roll in an airplane while talking on his cell phone. I think that anybody who is willing to flout the rules, like, for example, take people with you on a solo flight when you're a student pilot, that speaks volumes about the other kinds of rules that they're willing to ignore and the risk that they're going to take. And the FAA actually has on their list of penalties specific sanction for student pilots, flying with other people. That's considered fairly egregious. So yeah, I agree. When people spot these kinds of things, there are a lot of different things they should do. And one of them is not just let these people continue to fly without, some intervention of some kind.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, I think one of the big challenges we have, and we kind of alluded to it briefly, which is that CFIs are just not in their jobs for very long these days because the airlines are hiring them so quickly. And so it's certainly possible that the quality of flight instruction has gone down over the last couple of years simply because we have lower and lower time pilots who are teaching in the aircraft. What are your thoughts about the CFI certification process and things perhaps we could do to make it more rigorous so that we get the best CFIs in the skies?
Yeah. So, in addition to what I mentioned about, we're not just trying to certificate people who can, rattle off information about aviation. We're trying to certificate people who can guide others to be safe pilots. And that's what I say at the beginning of all instructor practical exams and flight instructor instrument practical exams. I want to know how you're going to teach someone what is FAA legal, but I really want to know how you're going to guide these students to be safe pilots, because knowing what's FAA legal is one thing, but if you're not helping your student develop a set of personal minimums that provides that buffer over legal, then you're really not doing your job. It's unfortunate that there's such a pilot shortage and therefore instructor shortage, because we certainly need more dedicated instructors. And it's a shame too, because as an examiner, I see a lot of these low time instructors, and unfortunately for a lot of them, they're doing a good job. They are trying their best. That this is not their terminal job in aviation, but they're making the most of it. And unfortunately, we do have these folks who, are not only trying to maximize their abilities as instructors, but, they just see it as a stepping stone and honestly an obstacle in their way to the cockpit. So, we just need to look out for these people, and if they're not cut out for instructing, they need to just find some other job in aviation or not. But we don't need these people as instructors.
Well, let's look at the flip side of that as well, which is who we do need. We've got a lot of people listening right now who have a lot of experience in aviation. Maybe they've got a couple of gray hairs. They've been around a while. Seems to me like these are the perfect people to kind of think, maybe I should become a flight instructor.
Yeah, that's a great idea. You make me think back to my mentor, Bill Kirshner. And he, I already had a full-time job before I even got into aviation. So I'm a part-time flight instructor at my aerobatic school. I fit that in with my other jobs and duties, and it's a total joy. But in his opinion, he thought the part-time instructor was the best instructor because they arrive, happy to be there. Every time I show up to the airport to teach spins, like I did last Friday, I did 2 CFI spin endorsements. And I am just thrilled to walk up to the airport, and my day is, devoted to these students. And to me, I have a lot of fun. I love being an instructor. And to me, it brings me a lot of joy. It brings me intellectual, satisfaction, and just the satisfaction of taking someone who says that they are nervous at the beginning and seeing them go away confident at the end. To me, it's just a total joy. So I think you bring up a great point. If maybe some of your listeners who aren't instructors, but maybe could squeeze in a day a week or, a few hours here and there across the week. We need good instructors. So I hope some people out there can see themselves, like you and I are both accidental instructors, right, Max? And I think it brings us both a lot of joy.
Totally. Yeah, I'm totally grateful to Tim Johnson 20 years ago for saying, Max, I'm getting my CFI this summer. You should too. And that's kind of the first time I actually started thinking about it. And I will say that there have been a number of occasions where I've been flying with a pilot, and I have flat out said to them, you should think about becoming a flight instructor. You would be great at it. And so I would encourage other people, when you run into these people, say that same thing to them.
Right. I just said that I was doing my ATP CTP course down in Dallas over the summer, and my sim instructor was a retired 777 instructor, and he had been decades out of general aviation. But he was so amazing as a sim instructor. I mean, he cared so much. Actually, his name is Mike Howe, if he happens to be listening. He was such a fantastic instructor. I just said, you have to get back into general aviation. And so his interests were piqued. And I'm hoping that he'll be back in the ranks of general aviation instructors at some point as well.
Well, that's great. Well, I hope we've inspired a few people to become CFIs, because clearly there is a need for that. Well, Katherine, any final thoughts here today?
Yeah, Max, I think that the flight instructor certificate is by far the most important certificate that the FAA issues. We have a lot of power in that certificate. We can show students how, if it's done safely, aviation can be a useful, exciting, intellectually satisfying part of either just a career or a hobby. Or, we can exhibit behaviors that are harmful or scary, and we'll send people away and they'll never come back to aviation. So we are aviation's ambassadors, and I'm proud to be among them. I know you are too, Max. And I just like to encourage more people who want to be a positive, serve a positive role in aviation to consider being an instructor.
Well, it is a fun career, and certainly there's nothing more satisfying than passing a CFI check ride. That was certainly a milestone for me. Katherine, where do people find out more about you and your flight instructing?
Sure. My flight school is Ace Aerobatic School, so it's aceaerobaticschool.com. I also write the Flying Smart column for Pilot Magazine, so I can be found in either of those places.
Katherine, thanks so much for joining us here again today. Always a pleasure to see you.
Thanks a lot, Max. Always a pleasure for me, too.
And my thanks to Katherine for joining us here today. You can find out more about her and her flight school at aceaerobaticschool.com. And just a reminder that I love hearing from you, and I read many of your emails on the show. If you'd like to send me a message, just go out to aviationnewstalk.com, click on Contact at the top of the page. That's absolutely the best way to send me a message. And of course, I also want to thank everyone who supports the show in one of the following ways. We love it when you join the club and sign up at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome to support the show financially. You can also do that at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. We also love it when you leave a 5-star review on whatever app that you're listening to us on now. But most importantly, please tell one or more of your friends about the show. That's the primary way that we grow the show. So please let your friends know about Aviation News Talk. And of course, if you're in the market for a headset, please consider buying a Lightspeed headset and using one of the links in our show notes, because if you use those links, they will donate to help support the show. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up. And remember that you can always go around.
You can always go around. If it don't look right coming down, don't wait until your side's baby sliding upside down.